All right. I'm sorry, I got to start again. Um, so what I was saying is that we are looking into the examination of the great high priest, Yeshua, by virtue of looking at the priests of Israel, and there are some things about them, some of the description about them. And then we're going to learn how important it is that we learn about the high priests of Israel. Um, the high priests are important because the priests are the ones that connect us with God, plus they are intermediaries like the Bakor, the firstborn, and they have a very special purpose. And we need to understand that if we're going to really get the blessing and benefit of um, having a relationship with God through Yeshua. So we're going to look at that this morning. And I want to focus on a few things. I'll remind you, though, that first of all, this letter called Hebrews or Messianic Jews was written to Jewish believers in the first century, probably around 65 of the Common Era. We don't know exactly when, but that's a pretty good guess based on some historical facts. We also don't know who wrote the letter, the epistle, the letter. Some people think different ones of the people of the Brit Hadashah, Paul, Silas, others as well. And I think the best theory that I've heard, and I don't want to take the time to argue this theory because it's not that important right now, is Luke. And there's a number of reasons for that. But whoever wrote it, we know that the Holy Spirit guided the writer, and that's why we have this wonderful epistle called Hebrews or Messianic Jews. And the first chapter of this letter, and we've looked at it the last couple of weeks, we see a great portrayal of Haben, the Son of God, in magnificent terms of deity and his eternality and his righteousness. Let's see here. I understand that my video is not on. I thought I turned it on. I'm going to start it now, but it says unable to start video. The host has blocked it. So Carrie, if you're out there, I guess you need to turn my video on because I have clicked on the little button and it's still got a red line through it. So do what you can, my friend. Anyway, I'll continue and you can hear me at least. And maybe I'll have a video here soon. The first chapter of Hebrews portrays the magnificentness of Haben, the Son, and we see a lot of wonderful things about that. The Son's deity, his eternality, his righteousness. He was the Lord occupying an everlasting throne, unchangeable. He was the victor of all of his enemies. And remember, when we began, the writer showed a comparison between Yeshua and the patriarchs and the prophets, and ultimately the angels as well. So he's completed the first comparison, and now we're going to go into the theme of comparing him to the high priest of Israel, which fortunately we just read a few things about this morning. This section goes from about chapter 2, verse 5 through chapter 8, chapter 10, verse 18. So it's quite a few chapters on the priests of Israel. And there's a really important reason for that, because the people of Yeshua's day did not know what to do with the fact that there was no priesthood ever since there had been some problems in the priesthood. So I got it. Turn on my video. I did now. Okay, there I am. So we have a long doctrinal section that comes out first, where we read the 4 qualifications of a Jewish high priest in Israel, and we see how they are perfectly fulfilled in Yeshua in every fashion. The first criteria for a priest is that he must be one with the people. He must be identified with the people. And we know that Yeshua did that. We're going to focus on that this morning. The second criteria of a high priest was the priest must be faithful in his service to God. We're going to read about Moses, a priest before Aaron took over the responsibility. He was faithful to God as a servant in the household, but Yeshua HaMashiach was faithful over the whole house of God as a son. The third criteria is each priest must have an appointment from God. Messiah did not exalt himself, but was appointed a high priest, as it says, after the order of Melchizedek. We'll be picking up on that later. And the fourth criteria is that every high priest offered sacrifices on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and he must be thoroughly cleansed of all of his sins before he was allowed to offer the sacrifices for the sins of the people. So our high priest, who is blameless, unstained, holy, undefiled, separated from sinners, needed to offer no sacrifice for his own cleansing. He was a different kind of high priest. So after the writer presents an intricate and complete argument in the first chapter of his epistle to show the Son's superiority to the angels, the author now shifts his emphasis. As I said, in order to show that the Messiah is perfectly qualified to be our high priest, and be the priest for all humanity, he builds an argument proving that Haben, the Son, is truly one with human nature, that his people may come to him, assured that he shares their circumstances and their feelings. He must also show that Yeshua shares our humanity in order to be the sacrifice that is needed to provide atonement for each one of us. So these are all factors that we read about in these first chapters of the letter to the Hebrews. In verse 5, there's a transition into a new emphasis. It says, "For he has not put the world to come of which we speak, that is the future world, in subjection to angels." No, he put this and suggests he put the world to come in subjection to man. And we see these references in Psalm 8. I'm going to read this to you real quickly. Psalm 8, verse 4 says, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you set in place, what are mere mortals? What is humanity that you concern yourself with them? Humans, that you watch over them with such care." He goes on to say, "You made him, that is humanity, man, a little lower than the angels, but you crowned him with glory and honor. You had him rule what your hands made. You put everything under his feet." That's the beginning of the creation, sheep, oxen, all of them. Also the animals in the wilds, the birds in the air, and the fish in the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the sea. That's a clear reference to Genesis, where God put all of creation under the domain of humans. And it's important to remember this because we need to understand where we failed. It's amazing to think about the fact that God designed human dominion over the universe because that's how he wanted to see it. But here the writer makes a bold statement because there was a segment of Jewish literature that spoke of angels as being in charge of the nations, while God was in charge over Israel. That was a traditional writing of the first century. But that's not exactly what happened. And the writer here is trying to make this clear. Michael, for example, was an angel who was spoken of as having charge over the kingdoms of Babylonia, Persia, and Greece. So there were some references in Daniel and other places where there were angels that were given charge over nations. And the idea was that God was going to be in charge over Israel. The author, however, attacks this idea head on in this traditional verse, because God has not put the world to come in subjection to angels, but rather in subjection to mankind. Thus, the human race becomes the new focus of attention here. Stay with me on this. The world that is to come, that is in the latter times after being renewed by the Messiah, is the dominion that God gave to his human creatures, but it was lost because of our human sin and causing us to be aliens and exiles. We defected on our own. But any authority we exercise over the earth is usurped authority now, because we can rightly attain authority only when we are first set free by the redemption of Messiah. So what happened was God did put the creation under man's authority at the outset, and that was the way it was meant to be. However, humanity blew it, as we know, is called the fall, and ever since then we've had nothing but trouble. So there's this idea that the humanity was given dominion over the whole earth, but that dominion came to a tragic demonic ending because of sin. And it's only in a relationship with the Messiah that can be restored. We were designed to be blessings of all the creatures, but fallen humanity's authority has become devastating to both the earth and the human race. The purposes of God in creation have been extremely frustrated. The ultimate goal is now unattainable. One can't consider the doctrine of creation without simultaneously considering the doctrine of human potential, because human potential is what God thought about when he gave man authority over creation. So the human potential, I want you to listen to this, the human potential that God gave man is staggering. Nothing has been left outside the control of subjection of humanity. The primal statement that begins with Genesis 1:26 and is echoed in Psalm 8, which I just read, says that not only are the things of the earth subject to humanity, but all the works of God's hands come under this potential dominion. Think about that. When God created the heavens and the earth, he put creation under human authority, human dominion. I know we think, how could that have happened given the way we humans have operated over the millennia? But that was the way it was at the beginning, and it is the way it will be at the end. This statement implies humanity in general, yet we can see that all of God's creation is subjected to every individual, whether great or small. Think about this. Each of us has authority over 168 hours every week, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 168 hours are under your authority and my authority. We have dominion over that. All of our emotions and our thoughts come under our determination, our decision. Even our possessions, some meager and some massive, are theirs. They're our possessions to do what we wish with them. We can give them to beggars on the street, or we can hoard them, any number of things. So the design from the Brit Hadashah is a similar view, but even more meaningful. So with humanity having possession over the world and knowing that our goal ultimately, God's goal ultimately, is that humanity will once again have dominion over the earth, we think of the words of John, the apostle and evangelist, in the prologue of his good news, his gospel. He said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, Yeshua, was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. Think about that. Yeshua was responsible for making everything in the world, including you and including me. Do you ever wonder if you are worth anything? I think sometimes we all go through times of doubt and depression, and we really wonder if anything that we can do good is of any value at all. We could cry out like the psalmist, "Oh God, who am I that you would even consider me? I can't believe that you would take a personal interest in me." Think about it. The heavens are so immense, and the moon and the stars are so awesome. How is it possible that God could care for us? We think, I am nothing, a nobody, compared with the cosmic immensity. And the truth is, when you think about how much space a human being takes up in all of the creation, it really is infinitesimal. We are as the psalmist said, we are just dust. We're really not anything too fancy schmancy, despite the fact that we might think that we are. I remember one time flying across the country, and I was looking down about 10,000, 15,000 feet up. I don't like heights very much. I don't like looking at the plane, but I looked down and I couldn't see any human beings on the ground, only 2 miles up. And so you wonder, how is it possible that God, who is in the heavens, sees us on the ground? Yet God says, God wants us to know that God takes note of us. I want to cry out and say, that's absurd. That's impossible. How could the great God of the universe care about us? It sounds ridiculous. But the Greek word that was translated, you are mindful of us, or you take note of us in verse 6, has the idea of focusing on humanity with an awesomely powerful telescope. The inconceivable immensity of the universe is not able to hide any one of us from God's attention. He picks us out, not only in the mass of all humanity, but out of the total cosmos. That's what the Bible tells us. And I got to say, that sounds absurd to me. It sounds impossible. But the overwhelmingly good news is it's true. God sees us. God sees us. Yeshua speaks of that. He knows the hairs on our head. So, and that's hard to count, but God knows us intimately. The second phrase he mentions here is that God cares for us. God cares for us like a loving physician making a house call. Now, I know that probably none of you have ever had a house call. When I was a young boy back in Greenbelt, Maryland, Dr. Wodak, who was our family physician, he would make house calls to all of the sick people that were around. Now, you're lucky if you can get a medical call with your doctor. Thankfully, I had one yesterday about something. And I love the fact that when it was all done, he said, take care, my friend. I like that my doctor called me his friend. We're not really friends, but that's what he called me. And it reminds me of a story I read about this boy that was 17 years old, and he suffered a gunshot wound in his left hand. He was emptying a 22 caliber rifle of its cartridges, and all of a sudden he heard his explosion. Well, evidently two of the cartridges hit one another and they detonated one of them in his hand. The force of the explosion was enough to send the disintegrating bullet through 3 fingers of that young man, shattering 2 of them. Well, he had a very beloved family physician in Hollywood who surgically removed as many of the fragments of the bullets as he could. Then he sutured the mutilated fingers back together, warning this young man of potential blood poisoning that might result from the bits of shrapnel he had to leave. Well, wouldn't you know it? There was blood poisoning. Massive doses of sulfanilamide staved off the need to amputate his fingers. This doctor came by every single day to dress the wounds of this young man, every day, and he brought him back to health. The man wrote, "For that I will love him forever." And the message is that in just such a manner, God cares for us with that kind of healing attention. God cares for us every single day, even though we may not recognize it, we may not realize it, we may not know what to do with that concept, but it's true. The amazing nature of the good news is that what appears ridiculous and impossible, that God cares for his individual people like us, is what the good news is. God does see us. He takes note of our condition. He knows where we are. Every one of us is on his radar screen, you could say, and he knows how to differentiate one of us from the other. It's amazing to think about this. Even more, we're not only recognized by God, but we have been given a special place in his world, a place of meaningful production. I want you to think about that for a second. God gave each one of us life, and he's given each one of us something to do, something specific to do. We have job descriptions from the Creator. We may not know them at first, but hopefully we learn them as we get older. And we remember things like all things were created by him and for him. So each of us has something to do. And that includes every person walking the face of the earth, created not only by the Messiah, but for a particular purpose in his kingdom. Have you ever thought about that? Each one of us that are listening to this message has been called by God to do something for the kingdom of Messiah. It may not be famous, it may be small, it might be as much as cleaning the toilets, which is considered a low level of work. But sometimes that has to be done too. And even though it's a low work, if we look at it as work that could be kingdom work, it changes our perspective on that kind of work and any other work that befalls us, because we want to be famous, maybe we want to have big positions, we want everybody to love us, but sometimes just getting by and not even letting people knowing much about us is perfectly fine for us to do our job in the kingdom of God. This purpose that we all have is called telos. Telos is our end, our design. It's a word that implies full potential. It implies the authority to be used for God's glory and his blessing for other people. No one can take our place. No one without us. The kingdom is less than complete. I'll say it again. No one can take our place. Your place is important to God, and no one's going to take your place. Your role is just as important as anybody's in the universe. And if we become productive according to God's design for us, we have matured. That's what it means to become perfect. We've matured. It doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes and sin, but the emphasis upon our productivity, our functioning in accordance with God's design. Thus, we're described with an adjective, teleos. The condition of having reached the purpose or goal is maturity. And maturity is a word that comes from telos, and it means to grow towards our purpose, to complete or make us mature. And we're going to see more about this as we continue. Well, with the psalmist, we can take humble joy in the fact that of our created design. It is not something we're responsible for, nor can we take the credit as self-made persons. No, we rather humbly recognize that God in the Messiah is our creator, and yet joyfully, because we know ours is a good creation, we can live with peace and calm. Our personalities and our purposes are beautifully matched, whether we know it or not. Our gifts of the Spirit within the body of Messiah are in perfect harmony with our created identity. We need not fear that God's going to ask us to do something we cannot do, because when he calls us to serve in his kingdom, he's not going to violate our personalities. He's not going to call me to do a 100-yard dash in 9 seconds. Ain't going to happen. But he might call somebody else in our congregation to run that fast. I'm not sure if I know anybody that can, but who knows? But God will not call us to be something in his creation that we can't be. He's given us all that we need. That's a great destiny. Our calling and our abilities are in harmony because God is the one who put it all together. There's not one of us who has attained, however, this high calling yet. Why? Because humanity left God's pathways years ago, millennia ago, and went to serve our own way. We know about that. In sin, which is what happens when we leave God's plan, in sin, both humanity in general and we as individuals have experienced tragic frustration in reaching our telos, our goal, our purpose. Think about that for a second as well. You sometimes think, I know I do, I'm not doing what I should be doing. I know I haven't made what I was supposed to do in my life. And I think most of us feel this way. Well, that's because our goals have been short-circuited by sin, which we did not choose to put into our life, but it came about at our creation, because all of us were created by God, yet sin entered into the world, crept into our lives early on. So the creative dominion that God wants us to have over the world is not very easily grasped by us. It eludes our grasp. Our knowledge of the earth and its ways is used to bring others under our dominion. The technology that we learn about produces nightmarish weapons, atomic bombs, nuclear holocaust, and more lately, it might just be that our technology produced the COVID-19 virus. That's still unknown, I guess, but humans have managed to create weapons that are just voraciously consuming our resources, and we should never use them. We have raped the earth, if you will. We've taken the best from the earth, and we don't treat it with respect. We pollute the skies and the streams. We denude the hillsides. We poison the oceans. I'm sure you've all seen the commercials for all the garbage that's in the beautiful oceans, and it's amazing how so many fish die because they think they're eating a worm or something. They're eating one of the little tops from the little coffee creamers that somehow get into the ocean because they look very, very tasty to fish. But we have not done a good job taking care of God's kingdom, but it ain't over yet. Paul writes in Romans 8:19, the whole creation is on tiptoe to see the wonderful sight of the sons of God coming into their own. That's from the Phillips translation. So there's hope, even though things are not where they ought to be, they will be where they ought to be. We know, but we do not see all things yet put under him, meaning mankind. No, man is not in charge again. God took that away, and God's design was for all things to be put under humanity's rule. But as we know, something terrible went wrong with the realization of the design. Humanity's dominion has been frustrated. Everything is not in subjection to humanity. That is, not yet. But verse 9 is good because we read, but we see Yeshua. With these words, the writer, whose deep insight and creative expression make him just really more enjoyable to read and get to know. It draws us into his next important thought. In some way, Yeshua is the answer to humanity's frustrated dominion. Somehow in Yeshua, each of us can realize the full meaning of God's creative design for ourselves. But how? Well, the answer is implied in this verse and the next verse, which like an overture to a symphony or the beginning of a play, speaks exactly as to what's going to happen. It's about his suffering and his sacrifice. Before he can offer the liberating sacrifice, he must suffer with his people as one of them, just as the high priest of Israel had to identify and be one of the people of Israel. In this case, we know that Yeshua, the Messiah, to fully identify with humanity, had to suffer. The first qualification of a priest of Israel was that he would be one with his people. He had to be an Israelite, not a foreigner or an alien. And according to that same principle, Yeshua HaMashiach had to be made like his brothers and his sisters so that he could walk in the human experience alongside them, stride for stride, and suffer with them. Thus, verse 9 says, he was made a little lower than the angels. Think about that. The Son of God was made lower than the angels for a time. That was where human beings were, lower than the angels. And that is where Yeshua, had to be. In making this reference to Psalm 8:5, we read that the text means he was to be lower than the angels, a little bit less than God, a little less than the angels as well. Having just proven in chapter 1 that the Son is essentially superior to the angels, now he asks us to regard the Son as having been made lower than the angels. But the reason is clear. Messiah must suffer the human experience. He must suffer even unto death in order to become a merciful and feeling high priest, to taste death for every person by God's gracious design. This is not easy to understand. This is not mankind's resolution to its own dilemma. It is not the way we would do it, but it's God's answer. Not a Greek or a Jew in these days would have God coming into human form and suffering and death to separate the people from their sins. This is the radical truth that is very difficult for us to understand, if not impossible. And many of the religious minds of Yeshua's day couldn't accept it. They wanted to do things and behave better, but they didn't understand the sacrifice of the Messiah. It went against all the religious dogma and teaching and philosophical concepts of the times. But here in verse 9, we read, the first time of the vicarious atonement, the Messiah died for us, that he might taste death for everyone. Now, the Greek word uses a word, the Greek text uses a word that's translated to taste. And that's a metaphor. It means to feel, to have the experience of. Messiah had the experience of human death, not just as any other human in the process of identifying with us in our experience, but on behalf of us or in our stead. In other words, he stood in for us. He stood in our place, and he took our death upon him. And that clearly shows his ability to connect with us. Our consciences are clean because of what he did, 9:14. So Yeshua appears in the presence of God for us on our behalf and in our stead. We're going to pick these teachings up as we go through the study of the priests and the priest sacrifices for the next 5 or 6 chapters of Messianic Jews. And it culminates in chapter 10. Yeshua appeared in the presence of God for us on our behalf and in human form. His experience becomes effective for every person on the earth. No human needs to go through this sort of death. God in the Messiah has already suffered it for us. No wonder Haben has been crowned with glory and honor. Now, he was sensing, the writer, that this was a very difficult concept for the mind of his people in his day to grasp. So he went right off and he said, it was fitting, verse 10, it was fitting, indicated that the Messiah's identification with you and me and his suffering on our behalf was very logical, was fitting. The Greek word that's used here means it's clear, it's obvious. In this instance, both circumstantially and morally. It was clear that this had to happen because of circumstances and morality. It is circumstantially clear in that there's only one way the Son can become our high priest. And what is that? He had to become one of us. He had to be a human born into a priestly tribe. And we're going to read about that later on. It is morally obvious because sin cannot be winked at by a moral God, but must be removed in a very close, costly manner, that of sacrificial death. However, there is a necessary condition for bringing the many children back to their design glory. It is the preparation or making ready of their author of salvation. He was making us perfect. He was bringing us to maturity. He was helping us to grow to where we need to grow. The glory to which Messiah is to bring many sons of God is that of their original design. In other words, going back to what God initially intended for humanity is going to take place someday when Messiah brings this about. Whatever has kept us human beings from realization of our telos, our glory, must be dealt with by this Son through his own suffering and death. It's a very important point to try to get. The glorious purpose is going to be fulfilled in a realization of dominion, as it says in Psalm 8, 6-7. A reconciled relationship, as it says in Genesis 3:3, and the recovery of everlasting life as it was meant to be, according to several references in John. For all of this, God is both initiator and culminator, giving life meaning and fulfillment without which the human heart cannot survive. The writer Viktor Frankl, who was in a concentration camp, he had great insight into this need of a human spirit for meaning and our purpose in life. In fact, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning from inside the concentration camp. This Jewish man understood about suffering in the concentration camps, and he said the most important part of being in the concentration camp, he had to find meaning in being there. So meaning is very important to us, and all of this meaning will come as we more and more connect with Yeshua. So He fulfilled his high priestly qualification by being identified with us through his suffering. There's no escape for him. He had to be our brother in full identification with our feelings and human pain. Remember last week I talked about Yeshua as our big brother. He had to go through this on our behalf. So these are things to keep in mind as we study this. So from the midst of the suffering of Yeshua, he is becoming our high priest. He knows every facet of our human pilgrimage. If you think about Yeshua, you see the same sort of message in his life. He was born poor. His people, the Jews, were oppressed by the Romans. His disciples did not understand what he was doing and what it was all about. He had great hostility from the people who should have adored him, the religious establishment, and he had to go through a corrupt, illegal trial, and he knew what was coming to him, the pain of a death so overwhelming we can't even fathom it, and the cruelty of the soldiers pounding nails through his hands and feet. And he hung on that cross for hours. His bones began to pull from their sockets. He experienced the alienation weight of the world's sin. He quietly watched the shades of death pull across his eyes until the final time he gave his last gasp of breath and gave his life to God as final act of suspicion. In this, he showed himself to be our ultimate priest. In the midst of the congregation and all its life, he was truly one of us. Never again can we cry out in the midst of our discouragement, opposition, our own pain. I know a lot of us feel discouraged sometimes and feel life's not going the way it should, and we're in a lot of pain. We can no longer say, but God, you are secure in your heavenly sanctuary with all your massive resources. What do you know about our human struggles? What do you know about living down here in this massive human decay? Amid all your power and glory, you have no idea what it feels like to have powerlessness and be helpless in our human experience. In other words, we can't look to God in the heavens and say, how do you know my pain? How do you understand my hopelessness? Well, since Yeshua the Messiah, God's unique son, Haben, the son, does know, something happened at this time, and that is that God was able, our God the Father was able to understand human experience when it was added to the almighty experience through the suffering of Haben. It says he learned obedience by what he suffered. He became our merciful and faithful high priest in his suffering. Don't forget that. That's why we study about his life and his death and also his resurrection, because in his resurrection, he conquered death, and that for us as well. So even though humanity has fallen, look around the world, you can see it all over. Things don't seem to get better, and it's very frustrating, and you might get very depressed. I know I feel that way sometimes when I look at the world news. I don't even watch the news anymore in the morning. It starts the day out really terribly, and I don't need to start out like that. So I just avoid the news in the morning. It's no good. So because of that, we need to remember that yes, there was a fall. The dominion that man had planned for humanity to have, the dominion that God had planned for humanity to have, failed because man blew it. Yet God is there. So somebody once said, "Oh God, do you know me?" "Yes, my child, I know you." "Then you indeed are my high priest. You understand what I'm going through." My friends, God understands what we're going through, no matter what that might just be. So examine yourself. If you're going through a tough time, just know that the author and creator of the universe, the Lord God of heaven and earth, in Yeshua Haben, identifies with us. He suffered with us, and he has become our high priest, sitting at the right hand of the throne of the creator in the heavenlies, interceding on our behalf. We'll learn a lot more about this as we continue studying the letter to the Messianic Jews of the first century who were suffering a lot in their day, not unlike some of the suffering we're having in our times as well. Be encouraged, my friends. Shalom, shalom.